Hello again, this is Jim at the house at Pooh Corner, and we are in the middle of a conversation with Richard C. Cook, whose book, Our Country Then and Now, is available to you, and it is a history of the United States from a primarily a monetary point of view. And we left off with in the colonial period, with Alexander Hamilton and what he did and didn't do for the United States. And now we're moving forward. We're going to take us up through the Civil War and the Federal Reserve Act and see where this conversation goes. And by the way, thanks for mentioning and explaining the NEED Act. I was involved with that for a while when I was in the trenches, having to do with public banking. But anyway, here we go with Richard C. Cook on monetary reform or not throughout the 19th and 20th part of the 20th century.
Okay, Jim, thank you very much. Glad to be here. We mentioned in the first session the issuance of the greenbacks. This was a large issue of money printed by the government under the Lincoln administration during the Civil War, which saved the Union. And it saved the Union because Lincoln didn't have the money to fight the war. When he went to the bankers in New York, who were, of course, the same as the London bankers, they were going to charge him up to 50% interest on loans to fight the Civil War. Lincoln and the Republicans in Congress said, to heck with that. We're going to print and spend the money. And they did that, and it was called greenbacks. There were successive issuance of greenbacks, and greenbacks formed a basic part of the American monetary system all the way into the 20th century. There's still greenback notes in circulation used by people in ordinary commerce up until almost the 1950s in small denominations.
One quote, I'm sorry to interrupt, but one quote that I used was Lincoln saying that I have two enemies. I have the bankers on the one side, and I have the Confederate Army on the other. And by far the most worrisome, the most intimidating are the bankers.
Yep, absolutely right. Now, a key figure was a president named Rutherford B. Hayes, who was elected in 1876, and he was the president who kind of filled the transition between the Civil War era and the modern industrial era. And Hayes was extremely alarmed because as he looked at what was happening in America, he saw the increasing discrepancy of wealth, where you had the people at the top, including the bankers, and the top industrialists getting richer and richer and richer. And this was what was known as the Gilded Age, while the people down at the bottom who did the physical work were sinking into poverty. And I'm going to read a short quote from Rutherford B. Hayes that probably most people haven't heard. In church, it occurred to me that it is time for the public to hear that the giant evil and danger in this country, the danger that transcends all others, is the vast wealth owned or controlled by a few persons. Money is power. In Congress, in state legislatures, in city councils, in the courts, in the political conventions, in the press, and in the pulpit, and in the circles of the educated and talented, its influence is growing greater and greater. Excessive wealth in the hands of the few means extreme poverty, ignorance, vice, and wretchedness is the lot of the many. And what are we seeing today? We're seeing the vast growth in power of the billionaires, the billionaire class. And the big banks are dominating and controlling every aspect of public life in every country in the world. And this is something that has been evident going back in our country to a period of time when people actually began to understand this. Hayes saw clearly the evils of big money and political power in combination. But the situation was destined to become much worse over the coming decades. Today, it is a national catastrophe. That's a quote from my book. Now, after Hayes, there was an epic struggle, what I call an epic struggle, between different concepts of money. The populists who were behind the greenbacks favored a flexible but growing currency. There was a greenback party that was formed that actually ran presidential candidates. The concept of bimetallism favored silver as a companion metallic backing to gold. But the bankers and the politicians beholden to them only wanted gold as a backing for currency. And it was the gold standard that eventually won out. And this was the gold standard that was favored by the Bank of England and by the American bankers who were in league with the Rothschilds and the other controllers of the Bank of England. So what I say here is U.S. bankers like J.P. Morgan were deeply in cahoots with the bankers of England. The bankers struck with the passage of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 and the Income Tax Amendment, which was designed to raise the money to pay for the federal deficit that was expected to come out of the passage of the Federal Reserve Act. It was a complete takeover of the U.S. economy by an alien political and financial force that began with Hamilton's First Bank of the United States and ended with the Federal Reserve, which was a de facto branch of the Bank of England. The banking syndicate used the wealth of the U.S. to finance World War I and the takedown of Germany. It created the speculative bubble of the Roaring Twenties. They set off the Great Depression by raising interest rates and returning the gold to England, which was the purpose of the crash of 1929. And your listeners are probably familiar with Eustace Mullen, who wrote his books on the Federal Reserve after meetings he had with Ezra Pound, the American poet Ezra Pound, who at that time was confined in St. Elizabeth's Hospital and who had a deep understanding of the banking and financial system. These same bankers set up Hitler as a foil to be defeated in war by the Soviet Union. And this is all documented in books that have been written about the tremendous financial support that the U.S. and Britain gave to Hitler to rebuild the military machine that then was goaded into attacking the Soviet Union in 1941. The bankers then created the Bretton Woods agreements and the national security state to extend Western military and financial hegemony over the entire globe. Thus, the power of bank money, spent more on speculation than anything else, became the most powerful force in the world and rules over the world today. But it has taken over everything it can, and since there's nothing left for it to gobble up, it is trying to consolidate its rule by massive population reduction and endless war against those nations still holding out. And these nations, of course, are mainly Russia, Iran, and China. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where I end up going with all this. And the second half of my book documents the history of the national security state, which is run by the bankers. And I document in here how the CIA itself was foisted on Truman in 1947 by an internal cabal within the federal government headed by the Rockefeller machine. And I even have a chapter later in the book called The Rockefeller Republic, because the Rockefellers, as the focal point of American banking, ran the government from the end of World War II onward into the present time. And so I go into this with all of the detail you might imagine from tracking through all of these historical travesties, including 9/11 and beyond.
Mm-hmm. Now, can you comment on how all of this is made manifest through the Kennedy assassination and the war in Vietnam? I've read wonderful books about the Kennedy assassination and why and how and all that. And So I'm pretty well versed on what happened and the reasons for it. As I put that through the filter and it comes out the funnel, the overriding reason, in my opinion, was to get the war in Vietnam up and running. And in my essay, All Wars Are Bankers' Wars, I didn't get that far yet. I ended at the end of World War I with my paper, but I was going to go on and get into that. So can you comment a little bit about how what you're saying, what you've said just in the last several minutes, might have something to do with the Kennedy assassination and maybe Bobby Kennedy and maybe Martin Luther King and the war in Vietnam?
Yeah, I remember that very well myself because when I was a senior in high school, a teacher came up to me in the hallway, and I was at that time the head of the International Relations Club. So I was pretty tuned in to what was going on in the world. And they said, go down to the office. You have to hear something. So I went to the office, and that's when I heard the broadcast that Kennedy had been shot. And so the impact that had on me was tremendous. And a big part of my cogitation over the years was, why did that happen? And what was the cause of it? And what were the consequences? And I read Mark Lane's book. I actually got in an argument with an attorney at the Yale Law School when I happened to be in New Haven about Mark Lane's book and the magic bullet theory. And boy, he was mad that I was questioning the magic bullet theory and the Warren Commission and its it's raising up Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone assassin. This lawyer was furious at me. Now, later, I got 2 books by a professor at the University of Pittsburgh named Donald Gibson. And I cite these books, and I would recommend these books to all of our listeners as what I consider essential background on the economic causes of the Kennedy assassination. Mm-hmm. And also, one thing Gibson said was, he said there were 2 primary institutions that were pushing for the Warren Commission report. One was the Washington Post, which it continued to do for decades. And the second was the Yale Law School, which really struck home with me because I had been there and talked to them. And yeah, they were really behind the assassination cover-up. But Gibson's other book on Kennedy's economic policies were absolutely brilliant because it showed that Kennedy was veering away from the banker-controlled economy toward indigenous economic development by a national economy, and Kennedy even issued greenbacks. Mm-hmm. There was a executive order that Kennedy
like 01111 or something like that.
For the use of silver certificates by the Treasury based upon silver owned by the government. And this was going to be spent into circulation for government expenses, not bank borrowed money or Treasury bonds, debt instruments, but actual indigenous currency. He was a greenbacker. He was under severe attack by some very important and powerful people for his economic policies. Another one was the Alliance for Progress, where he was going to go down into Latin America and provide assistance to Latin American countries to develop their own indigenous economies, whereas up until then, Latin America was just a cash cow for the business. Well, let me give you 2 names who went after Kennedy. David Rockefeller. David Rockefeller came out with a series of articles in Life magazine, and he was very suave and urbane and polite and explaining particularly why low interest rates by the banking system really wouldn't be good for America. We needed, a strong economy, strong dollar, high interest rates, but that was the crux of the matter. Interest rates meant the money went to the bankers from the economy, not into economic production.
Yep.
The other interesting figure in this whole dynamic was Nelson Rockefeller,
Mm-hmm.
because it was Nelson Rockefeller in the 1930s who had uh, a government position, who was in fact the head of what became the CIA in Latin America, running the Latin American economies and governments through his banking connections. And when Truman decided there would be no CIA at the end of the war, the man who came to him to pressure him to create the CIA was John McCone, who was a Nelson Rockefeller protege who would become the Deputy Secretary of War. He was the one who went into Truman, pressured him to create the CIA, and from that point on, the CIA was run by the Rockefellers. And that's all in open sources. It's documented. It's in my book. And when Kennedy was assassinated, who ended up on the Warren Commission, along with Allen Dulles and these other characters? John McCone.
Okay. Now, there's before I forget, there's a book that covers the whole thing that was prohibited, that was quashed by the Rockefeller family. And the book was by Charlotte and her husband, Jerry Dennett. Do you know that book?
Yeah.
Okay. It's a thick, 400-page book. It goes into everything that the Rockefellers did in Latin America.
Right.
And they were able to intimidate the publisher to basically, there's a word for it in the publishing world, I forget what it is. It means unpublish
Right.
something, to bury it. And
Yeah.
now it's out. You can get it online, and it's something like Thy Will, I think the title of the book is called Thy Will Be Done,
Wow.
but I'm not positive of that.
Okay.
So anyway, I say this to reinforce what you have said
Yeah.
about the Rockefellers. They kind of slipped from my memory about all this, but yeah,
Right.
they tried to arrange the whole South Central American colonial shtick racket,
Right.
so that the money flowed through the central bankers.
Right. Exactly. And the big investors today in Latin America, China.
Mm-hmm. And they're
Right.
destroying
Mhm.
it. They're even destroying Latin America and Central America faster than
Yeah.
the banana republics did.
Yeah.
There was
So-
another question that was on the tip of my tongue. Oh, well, no, go ahead. I'll think of it.
So after Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and Johnson was sworn in, this, of course, opened the gates for a Republican president to step in and take over. So that's when Nelson Rockefeller made his big move.
Mm-hmm.
Made a play to he wanted to become president, and he wanted the 1964 Republican nomination to be his. Well, the conservative Republicans, who were very upset about Nelson Rockefeller's divorce and remarriage, and viewing him anyway as the liberal branch of the Republican Party, nominated Barry Goldwater.
Mm-hmm.
And so, am I saying there was a connection between the Kennedy assassination and Rockefeller's presidential aspirations? Of course not. I would never allege such. But the sequence of events is pretty interesting, isn't it? And of course, Nelson never became president. He became vice president.
Mm-hmm.
Till in 1976, Gerald Ford dumped him from the ticket, and he died soon afterwards. But the trajectory of Nelson Rockefeller and his brother David, who created the Trilateral Commission and the Group of 30 and all this other stuff, all the way up into the 21st century, the trajectory of those two and the rest of the whole, conglomeration, focusing on the Council on Foreign Relations, which to this day is still the body that is controlled by the banking system, and now we have the neocons thrown into the mix, is all still part of the Rockefeller system, which is based upon absolute control of fractional reserve banking and the empire of usury.
Okay. Now, I
All the links
remember,
it has to Europe,
pardon?
with all the links that it still has, of course, to Europe and the city of London.
Now, one of the reasons that I have read for the killing of Kennedy was his support of the public money that you referred to. And the more I read, the more I looked into it, I felt that that in itself was certainly not a significant factor in the murder of Kennedy, because those people had ways of brushing off that kind of an assault like you'd kill a mosquito. So I still don't know the answer to that, and I'll ask you how important you think that was. But all my research brings me to the much bigger issue of the Vietnam War.
Right.
He had clearly said, we're pulling out, we're not going any further with that, and that's
Right.
that. And Martin Luther King was doing the same thing, and Bobby was on the horizon there also. So do you think that the executive order by President Kennedy was a significant factor in his assassination?
I think it more illustrates his whole attitude toward economic development, which was so contrary to where the banking system wanted to go, that it was just one little piece of the puzzle. We also know that Kennedy was moving in a direction toward world peace.
Yes.
We know that particularly from his American University address that took place in the spring of 1963, but also his plans to pull out of Vietnam. And that brings us to another issue involving the Rockefellers. And again, I also document this in my book. Just before World War I, there were a series of studies that were carried out by the Council on Foreign Relations and issued to the Roosevelt administration that laid out very clearly a long-term program for the United States to attain complete global military control of the entire world. And those studies exist, they're known, they're in the record, and they were presented to the Roosevelt administration. Now, Roosevelt himself had an idea of what you might call peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union and even with China, which showed up in the United Nations Charter. Of course, Roosevelt, when he died, there was a palace coup that put Harry Truman in charge. And Truman, of course, was simply an instrument of what were becoming the globalists of the time and the national security state. So there was a project underway that had already begun for the U.S. to develop military control over the entire world, and the taking over from France in Indochina when France had been defeated by the revolt of the Vietnamese. It was a natural thing under this doctrine for the U.S. to step in and become the controller of Southeast Asia. And of course, you have all of the resource implications of that, the oil offshore, the whole economic motivation of the U.S. moving in to become the power in East Asia that it was now able to do because it controlled Japan and the off-sea islands of Japan and moved back into the Philippines. The whole configuration of modern Western influence in East Asia was moving into place. And Kennedy turning his back on that and walking away from that, what a travesty that must have been. Plus, you had the CIA controlling the heroin trade in Southeast Asia, Golden Triangle and all that, which was a vast resource for what became the national security state and the funding source for their black budgets that went on almost until today.
Mm-hmm.
So you had all that coming into play, and Kennedy walking away from that was no doubt viewed as a traitor, particularly with Bobby in the wings and then after him, Teddy. So there were people envisioning a whole generation now of Kennedys taking the U.S. in the exact opposite direction that the bankers wanted it to go in.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the Philippines. They got their independence in 1946, but that was their political independence.
Right.
They became slaves to the banking cartel. And I wrote a piece about what their debt level was then and what their debt level is now. And, it's greater than their GDP and their GNP. So anyway, that's the way it works.
That's the way it works.
One other question that what's happening right now today is a scorched earth policy, which I get from the guy whose name I can't think of, but you said that you listened to him also.
Brian Berletic.
Yeah, and then I got Colonel McGregor, who agreed.
Yeah.
So we get these two great military and economic minds agreeing that the United States and Israel, which is the same entity as far as I'm concerned now, they have agreed that the scorched earth procedure will continue.
Yes.
And so they're working on that in Syria. They're bombing everything. They're turning Syria into rubble. And they're going to do it to Lebanon. They're going to do it to Palestine, which they've been doing for many, many years. And they want to do it to Libya. And then they've got to worry about Turkey and Iran. So we've only got 1 minute. Do you have a quick comment about that?
Well, that's what's happening. This is what some people are calling World War III. It's underway. It's happening. And of course, the end of the road there in the Middle East is Iran. Mm-hmm. They're desperate to take down Iran. Mm-hmm. And the big questions there is, will Russia stand behind Iran? Will China stand behind Iran? Mm-hmm. Where will the battle lines finally be drawn? Or will the U.S. and Israel just continue chipping away? Mm-hmm. And how will all of that come to an end? We don't know. My own solution is to abolish, outlaw fractional reserve banking and usury. Yeah. And then the thing will come tumbling down where we are.
Okay.
And
well,
we're worried about in Iran.
Well, our time is up. So thank you very much, Richard C. Cook. And your book is Our Country Then and Now. And you can look it up. Thank you for listening. Bye. Yeah.